My name is Sarah Jane Demy, and on behalf of the Demy-Colton team and our partner for this salon, Biotechgate Digital Partnering, represented by Patrick Fry over here, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 35th installment of the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series. As many of you know, Demy-Colton's mission is to convene healthcare industry leaders to catalyze change. And we do this through in-person events, including BioFuture coming up in November here in New York City, Biotech Showcase, which takes place out in San Francisco during the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference. We like to call it Biotech Showcase Week. Our CEO summits, one of which it takes place in Europe and the other of which takes place in the States, as well as through our virtual salon series. The topic of today's salon is runway extension in difficult times, a very popular topic during our CEO summits recently. As noted earlier, we have partnered with Biotechgate Digital Partnering out of Switzerland. I was going to invite Patrick to speak so you knew that he came from Switzerland. Patrick, you want to say hello?
Yeah, well, welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to work with you, Sarah, and the team, and thanks all the panelists for participating. So that was my Swiss accent, as promised.
Right, thank you so much for that. We were hoping to bring this discussion to a much wider audience, and Patrick helps us do that. Some housekeeping notes before we turn the virtual mic over to our moderator. The salon will start with a 50 to 55-minute discussion, and that will be followed by a Q&A session. And I think all of you are pretty familiar about where you can post your questions. Please do make them concise so that our panelists can read them and get their arms around them before they respond to you. Please note, as you heard, that the salon is being recorded and it will be available for on-demand viewing later on today. Now to the salon, I am really pleased to introduce our moderator. Her name is Leslie Stolt. She is Vice President for Early Innovation Partnering at J&J Innovation. And as well, she is the leader of Bio's business development training programs, which take place at almost all of Bio's meetings, including our partners' meetings in Europe and in the States. So we have a very long history with Leslie. And she is joined by Dawn Bell, who is the Global Head of Strategic Partnerships at Novartis Pharmaceuticals. Welcome, Dawn. Felipe Lopez Fernandez, Executive VP and Chief Business Officer at Ipsen. Welcome, Felipe. And Yushine Scarlett, who is a principal at MPM Capital. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the virtual mic over to Leslie. Leslie, the show is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Patrick, for the invitation and the opportunity to moderate this panel, and welcome everybody. Good morning. Thanks.
I mean, I could just maybe add to that. I mean, I think that's true. And I think one of the drivers for that is just the abundance of capital that we have in the ecosystem today relative to maybe the last downturn. I think one report that I saw, I think it was from PitchBook, in regards to just the capital raised by various venture groups, not specifically biotech, but just venture groups within the US. I think in last year, the full total was 142 billion, whereas just the first half of this year, it's 137 billion. And so if you imagine that, if we keep up at a similar pace, we're bound to be, you know, almost 200 million or 200 billion or above 200 billion by the end of the year. So I think there's just an abundance of capital that we just haven't seen, not only within our sector, but just more broadly speaking from a venture dollar standpoint. And that did, of course, as you mentioned, Dawn, really drive a lot of the emergence of these new biotech companies that we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's definitely the combination of the two. New people, new CEOs that have only seen the good times, and the inflation of every round, Series A, Series B, crossover, IPOs. They've only lived in an era where, you know, capital was, you know, pouring. You know, you needed more, you would get more, and suddenly they see the downturn, and they find themselves in a situation where they have so much burn because they've they've lived in a world where you just had to ask. So you would start so many projects in parallel, hire so many people, etc. 10 years ago, people were a bit more careful, and it's creating a unique situation.
That's great. So I think, so while we talk about that and the runway extension, so this concept of runway extension and what does that mean, I think that what's really important for these companies today is to somehow have the money to get through 2023 and get through this environment that we're in and into 2024. And I think we've all sort of agreed that there are three main levers that we can pull in order to do that, that companies can pull in order to do that. The first one is burn reduction, which I think, Philippe, you were starting to allude to. And then there's partnering in order to perhaps decrease the burn and share it and share the risk with someone. And then obviously there's bringing more money in. And so, let's start with burn reduction. And what are some of the things that people can do, and what do we have to really think about as companies and leaders in these companies? Let's start with that particular lever that we can pull. Who would like to start with comments around that?
I mean, maybe happy to maybe just kind of start and maybe reflect on maybe some of the comments that topics that we broached during our prep meeting. So I think from a burn reduction standpoint, again, referencing maybe another BioCentury report, I think they had a really nice summary of public companies that had some level of reduction. And I'm trying to remember how they quantified it, but I think you saw it was over 20 or so public companies that had some reduction in FTEs, so people capital. I think we've seen many companies on the public side announce maybe reprioritization of their pipeline. So oftentimes, or at least in the new modalities sector or space, we saw many companies with upwards of 5 different tissue types or therapeutic areas that they were going after. And then for each tissue type or therapeutic area, they had 2 or 3 programs for each. So you have these massive pipelines that does create a lot of optionality, but what that also does do is contribute to significant burn. And so a number of these companies, more platform in nature, were reprioritizing their pipeline, not necessarily reducing it down to a single program, but maybe cutting it almost in half to reduce cash burn. As a result of that, of course, there was a number of layoffs for some of these bigger companies. And that was maybe one of the topics that we were talking about during our prep session, which from a people standpoint, I think there are many CEOs who've actually gone out on a limb to really ensure that the culture is maintained within their organizations, that there is some path to next opportunity that is fitting to the talent that they're letting go. So it's a hard decision to reprioritize. The consequence of reprioritization, of course, is people capital loss. And I think we've seen in the sector a number of CEOs that we can actually point to that have done a really good job facilitating that process, but it's a hard process. And that's maybe one example of how we've seen, at least on the public side, a large number of platform companies reducing cash burn.
Yeah, basically what you do is you reduce the number of projects, and by reducing the number of projects, you start saying, okay, what are the people that I need to focus on what remains. Of course, the projects are still there. You don't necessarily, I mean, some were very good projects that you still want to resuscitate when the time is right. And you want to make sure that you're going to do this reduction in the right way. Keep some of the expertise that you need and that you don't want to completely lose. So it's really something where you need to make really tough calls that affect key talents from your organization. And doing it right is going to really make an impact.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, deciding, which programs to cut is that can be quite daunting. And what I would advise CEOs is to really work closely with your board on this, like really get feedback from your investors. What are your most precious R&D? What is your most precious R&D? And how do you preserve that most precious R&D so that you could live to fight another day and then perhaps take up these other programs? And then once you have that decision, working closely with your board, really be decisive and then sell that internally, right? You got to sell it to your people that are going to stay. And you've got to give them, that compelling reason to stay. And I think that, everything rises and falls on leadership in my experience. And so it really becomes incumbent upon, your leader, you're working closely with your leadership team. And as the CEO, over communicating with people, creating as much transparency as you can. If you have to do layoffs, doing that with the utmost of compassion, as Yushini, described, helping your employees who are furloughed to find other roles, because as we've said, there's been a talent crunch, right? So there is an opportunity for this talent to find other opportunities. And so I think it really requires CEOs to put their company and their employees, above themselves, preserve your most precious R&D, and really listen to that feedback from your investors as to what they consider your most precious R&D, because you want the true believers to be there at the table with you as you move forward and need to raise additional capital to progress things forward in your company.
And any comments from the panelists here on sort of the new companies that are, forming and what you're seeing out there? I know this is sort of jumping a little bit to one of the other levers, but I do think it's interesting, the difference between some of the companies in Europe and the United States, where in the US, it was just so frothy and people were actually raising a lot of money and building relatively large companies. What are we seeing, or what are your thoughts about sort of the next 8 to 12 months or 24 months in these European companies who perhaps have slightly different levers to pull because they never grew so big, right? Any thoughts around that?
Well, one of the problems with Europe is usually it takes more time to react, because it's more difficult to lay off people. It's so the speed at which you can do things is going to be affected, and that's why usually people tend to grow more slowly, because you don't want to hire 200 people and then find out that you're in a tight spot. The problem is it's going to take time to adjust, and then it's going to take time to rehire people. So you're always fighting with the speed at which you want to move as a biotech with the speed at which you can move in Europe. So that's a little bit the issue. That being said, there's probably less of an issue on that front compared to US biotechs that have hired massive teams just because they could, and that are really facing the dilemma of saying, I don't know how long the downturn will be. If it's 6 to 12 months, I can keep quite a few people. If it's 24, 30 months, I need to go fast down.
Yeah, I mean, I can comment on maybe on the earlier stage companies. So before MPM, I spent some time with a group that was affiliated with Oxford, the city more broadly, and kind of the whole mission there was to really kind of drive innovation within that ecosystem and to make it somewhat competitive with Cambridge, UK. There's been a number of reports that have really shown kind of the impact that this group has had on the Oxford ecosystem from a biotech standpoint or just a startup standpoint. And so we've seen, the ecosystem flourish from a new company creation standpoint over the last 5 years, with it peaking in regards to just the amount of capital coming into the ecosystem within the last 2 years. And examples of companies that have IPO'd from that group includes companies like Vasitech, which was built there, as well as another company called PepGen. So I would say in Europe specifically on the early side, and I think this is similar to what we're seeing in the US, we're not seeing a significant hit similar to what we're seeing on the public side just yet for these early stage companies. And, you know, if you were to categorize kind of early stage companies based on modalities, I think for the new modalities, there's still high interest with a lot of, you know, tier one blue chip capital to really support, you know, these types of modalities. And I think we're seeing the same both in Europe and also in US and the UK. And I would say that there's also just more established funds in the Europe ecosystem as well as in the UK that's providing that capital support that we probably didn't see historically. And that is also, of course, providing some level of runway for those earlier stage companies. So I wouldn't say, at least on the seed Series A, maybe approaching Series B, I think we haven't seen a dramatic shift in their ability to access capital. I think instead of going out and saying we're going to raise $100 million, dollar Series A or £100 million Series A, people are now saying, okay, do we actually need that amount of capital? And I think they've reduced kind of the quantum that they're going out and asking for investors. Whether or not that will change in the next 12 months, I think we're still waiting to see that. But I don't think we're there yet, just on the seed and Series A front.
Right. Don, did you have a comment on this question, or did you want to?
I wondered, Yushini, if you could maybe comment a little bit about the company creation model, because I think what I see more, you have all this, dry powder, but you also have perhaps larger rounds in a company creation model where, with some VCs that they've been very successful. Do you see sort of the next, the recovery kind of when we look at all that dry powder being deployed, even more focus on that company creation model with high ownership and sort of high levels of control, early and through Series B?
I think the company creation model is complex. I think historically, groups who've always done it have the right resources to really deploy for company creation. One of the big drivers there, of course, is talent and really access to, I think one of the earlier comments that we were talking about is having experienced management teams that you can actually pull into your company. So, at NPM, groups like Atlas, we have entrepreneurs in residence or executive partners who can actually pull into these companies that we're building from day one. And that's really a primary driver, for nucleating an idea and a company build. I think over the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of non-traditional company building funds really enter the company building space. And I think that's where we're now seeing different profiles of companies that are almost not really experimental in nature, but maybe deviating from what we've seen historically. So I think maybe we'll see less of that, or maybe just at least a recognition that there is a key set of components that you really need to get right for building successful companies. I think for companies or firms that historically do larger commitments upfront for company builds, so historically that's your Arch or that's your flagship. I think based on what we see in release in the public domain, I don't think we're seeing significant shifts. I think we're seeing even maybe more of that. And I think we're seeing bigger amounts deployed upfront for seeds or Series A, but we're not seeing that across the board. We're seeing that for maybe just like 1 or 2 firms. So we're not seeing dramatic shifts in regards to how company builders are approaching kind of the philosophy of building a company and deploying capital. And at NPM, we have examples like Elevate Bio, where that was maybe a bigger capital commitment that we've announced in the public domain from day one, but that doesn't necessarily remove kind of our more disciplined approach to companies like Orna in regards to the capital that we deploy for that seed. So for kind of the more traditional company creation firms, they're not dramatic shifts from their models. And we're just going to see maybe fewer kind of non-traditional company builders, moving forward.
So there is a question that I think we can start to address, both thinking about this lever of burn reduction, but also in the partnering as another lever that we can pull. And that question is around, do we see sort of either from what we've heard in the marketplace, what we've seen as people summarize the first half of the year and think about the second half of this year and into 2023, are there therapeutic areas or platforms that may be more fundable or successful in this environment than perhaps others? And I think this is sort of an interesting now transition into some of the other things that we want to talk about. What I want to preface it with partnering is that in the first half of 2022, there have been almost 600 partnerships, right, that have been put in place. And it just seems like such a huge number. About 100 of those, so 20%-ish, are involving pharma, right? And that's sort of the top 15 pharma. And of course, we know there are more partnerships that are happening all the time amongst small companies, between mid-sized companies, boutique companies. And so let's spend a few minutes sort of talking about partnering and are there areas that perhaps may be more successful today and in this environment than others.
Maybe before we talk about partnering, there's something that we need to establish right there. The situation is very different for public companies and private companies.
Yeah.
And this is for restructuring, this is for refinancing, this is for partnering. Public companies are going to first, they got hit much more. A lot got investors that didn't really know what they were putting their hands on. They don't have the benefit of having the investor quality of the private companies that know what they're doing and can have a discussion with the CEO and the leadership team on what are the right measures to address the situation. Public companies, they need to find a rapid way to change, a rapid decrease of the burn, and they need, even when they look at partnering options, they need to be aware that what they do is going to be scrutinized and is going to be seen as a validation, perhaps, but also a valuation of their technology. And that's why it's difficult. A private company might go for a lower deal at these times to say, okay, I take the validation and I'm not going to necessarily disclose the full terms. But a public company, doesn't have this luxury, and the terms are going to be disclosed and will make a precedent, which is not easy. So they're kind of a very tough situation because of the public exposure.
Agreed. Other comments sort of along the same line of partnering or areas of interest? I think that the one sort of overarching comment that I think we all agreed on during our prep call is that partnering will always be for like pharma, and our partnering is always strategic, right? It is, we have a plan and we have to execute on it, and it's not going to save the system. It's not going to save the situation that we are all in today. But let's talk a little bit about how we can move forward with the how is partnering changing or not, as the case may be.
Yeah. So maybe I could chime in on a few points here, Leslie. I think you hit the nail on the head. It is certainly for most companies of substantial size, from Ipsen to J&J and Novartis, it is all about strategic fit. We're not that price sensitive. I mean, you see a little bit, a few more deals getting done because prices are right sized, I think, in the eye of the acquirer, not so much that they're cheap, right? But they always have to be strategic. And one of the things that I see, especially in earlier stage companies who I work with a lot, is that they cast such a wide net without any consideration of strategy. And you really need to know your customer. I mean, at the end of the day, when you're partnering, these partners are your customer. And so how do you tailor your offering to their needs and their strategy? And you really need to do your homework and figure that out. And then also figure out, is it even worth your time to try to engage? Because as you know, this can take a long time. So you want to fish in the most fertile waters you can find. And there's certainly for all the bigger companies that are publicly traded, plenty of public information that can steer you in the right direction, whether it be investor presentations, R&D day, annual reports. I mean, we're an open book, right? You can tell what we're interested in. And so, I think it's really important that companies do their homework and have their own strategy for partnering and understand, who are the best, the best prospects for them.
And this is where, if you've done your work correctly, you've established already connection with several pharma companies. Even if you are not ready to partner yet, you have established connections. You have discussed about your technology, your programs, and you can move with these connections faster and say, okay, 6 months or 12 months ago, I said we would not partner at this stage, but actually now, because of the situation, we'd like to partner. And the discussions on the science have already occurred, and there's an easier way to proceed. Of course, if you need to start from scratch, it's going to take more time.
Yeah, I think that actually it's a really important point is that in 2020 and 2021, there were a lot of money came into companies. There are a lot of companies that felt that they were funded well and didn't have to partner until there was more value that they brought to the programs that they have internally. I do think it's important as people think about the concept of partnering that, if you've been sort of given a mandate by your board or your leadership that, oh goodness, we need to partner some of these assets out or these programs out in order to share the risk. It's, if it's an early stage molecule or program, it may not bring in as much money up front that's going to help you have that extension into the 2024 timeframe. However, it can perhaps help reduce the burn a little bit. But the early stage programs do have sort of guidelines from within our industry as to what the upfront payments are and what the how much those cost. And so I think it's important to sort of have an idea around that as you take your partnering program out and set the expectations internally appropriately. Ishani, any comments from your perspective as the investor and boards that you might sit on and that you might share with other investors, and what dynamics are happening in the boardroom around some of this stuff?
On partnering specifically, or just broadly on this topic?
Yes.
I mean, on this topic, I think I can maybe just speak to peers and maybe just industry-wide reflection on strategies. I think for most other venture capitalists that I speak to, there is a trend of really just making sure that the portfolio has sufficient cash runway. I think most people are thinking out to 2024 is kind of the right time frame, because 2023 it's still a lot of uncertainty, and then going into 2024 you do want to have some cushion to ensure that you can weather what is still yet to come. So I think that's like one consistent strategy that I've heard from peers in the venture world, which is just making sure that the portfolio is well taken care of. I think from a partnering standpoint, obviously, if you have a platform or if you have multiple assets, that's an easier maybe strategy that you can consider both at the board level, but just not also when it comes to internal discussions that management team has. I think collectively, we're still seeing a lot of preclinical deals. Again, referencing another BioCentury report, I think they showed that in 2020, there was upwards of 600 or so preclinical deals that were done. In 2021, I think it was maybe 400. And I think already in 2022, we're almost at 400. So I think we're still tracking just from a number of preclinical deals in a very favorable way. And I think you're seeing a lot of that from the fact that there's been a lot of new modality companies that tend to be more platform in nature than asset centric. And that does then afford the company multiple opportunities to really think about partnerships and different ways to split their platform. For single asset companies, I I can't really speak to maybe trends that I've seen, but they, of course, obviously will have maybe a more challenging time. But they still are companies that I can think of. I think Akiro is a publicly listed company, and initially they started off with a single asset, and they're still, able to really kind of think about expanding kind of the number of indications that they're going after for a single asset. But they're probably not going to be focused too much on partnering, and it's really just making sure that they can execute in a way that will hit those milestones that will drive increased value. But I, again, just in summary, I think the trend that we're seeing in the venture space is just to really be focused on the portfolio and ensuring that there is that cash runway out to 2024.
Yeah, and I think that some of the trends that have been highlighted by, say, Silicon Valley Bank in their analysis of the first half of the year is that, and this will sort of get to this concept of therapeutic areas and what's still being invested in. This is more from the investment standpoint, and what they're seeing is a little bit less on the rare disease side as investors sort of get the concept that the big pharma companies are looking for programs that are going to impact a larger population and have commercial viability, and have that as an important filter for what the larger companies are looking for. And so some of the investment is now returning back to, interestingly, neuroscience and larger markets, and which is great as we get more biology information to be able to have perhaps a little bit more precision in some of the solutions that we're trying to find for patients. And I think also additionally, one of the items that was noted was that also, even though oncology is still a very big space for investment, companies that are targeting the really, when small companies come together, they really want to do their discovery efforts around something that's genetically viable and definable, but it could be a very small population. And I think there's some pulling back on investment in companies that are just focusing on very small indications. So I think, go ahead.
I was going to say that, one of the things that we saw, sort of in the frothy times, the before times, was really a lot of capital going into cell and gene, into immuno-oncology. So we have a lot of companies in that space. And, I think it's really challenging to differentiate yourself. And so, but I think there, as you mentioned, 600 partnerships, only 20% are like kind of a top 15 pharma. I think there's a lot of opportunity for companies to work amongst their peers, to look for synergies, especially around manufacturing. If, maybe, a cell and gene company has some investment in manufacturing that you could potentially leverage, either as part of a reverse merger or potentially just, as a collaboration, or, some type of deal that you could work out amongst peers. I think that's another way to, again, with the idea in mind that we're preserving our most precious research that we have in the ecosystem. We want that to survive. We want it to, so that when capital flows back in, we can fund, an expanded amount of research. I think that's, that's really what we're lotting to do here.
It's a good point, Don. I think it's a time where instead of looking at every other company in the field as a competitor, you might need to turn to them as a partner and join forces. It's going back to the partnering. What should be clear also is we're not looking for cheap deals. We're looking for the right deals. It's clear that some of the valuation that have eased a bit are making some deals now making more sense. But on the other side, it's not. It still needs to make sense from a strategic point of view, and we're looking at technologies and assets that are going to convince us internally that these are the right assets for our companies. And that's going to be at the end of the day the key factor.
Yeah. And maybe just I'll comment on maybe a point you made, Leslie, in regards to maybe partnering, but then also financing for companies that have a stronger focus on program. and that really kind of being the motivation around partnering and or financing. I think on the late stage side, and maybe just to reflect on, you know, how groups like NPM tend to approach company building around platforms. We tend to be very product focused. So most of our companies from day one, there's always a very clear product that's defined. And this is very similar, you know, to our peers like an Atlas as well. But I think looking at later stage investors where my peers sit at maybe, you know, crossover or maybe Series B, Series C's, I think what I've heard from a lot of investors in that space is that they've now started to shy away from just preclinical, undifferentiated platforms and really have started to look at companies that have a very clear line of sight around a single program. So a very program-centric narrative is really kind of driving the interest of late-stage investors today. Obviously, I can't comment on that deeply because I'm not a late-stage investor, but that is one thing that I'm hearing from a lot of my peers on the late-stage side. So being able to really say, okay, within 12 months, there's likely to be, you know, either a clinical signal or at least a first-in-human data set that you can assess is maybe a big priority for a lot of folks in that space.
And I'd say that's probably true too for the larger pharma, you know, partnerships where we're really very product focused, and you know, platform deals are I think much more rare for us. We do them sometimes for, you know, very strategic reasons, but for the most part, we're looking for products.
Interesting.
And you know, the next inflection point, and when, you know, we expect some new data, something to happen to the program is going to be really determining what are the options that you can pull, whether it's partnering or financing. You know, if it's, you know, in a long time, then you're going to have to raise survive until then, or do something, or do a deal or financing at terms that are not what you expected, because there's definitely more risk. So there's going to be situations like that where, you know, you need to take the tough decisions. I think there's a question about licensing regional rights.
Thank you. I was going to go to that next.
Yeah,
excellent.
And you know, it's a difficult option. I mean, it's a difficult option because yes, it's a possibility, and if you can get, you know, enough cash for that to get you to the next inflection point, yeah, sure, do it. But, you know, if it's just going to be a patch, and, you know, it's going to make it more difficult to attract a partner because you've given up rights to a key geography, then, you know, think twice. It might be better to find a global partner right away at terms that are not exactly what you wanted in terms of upfront, but where you can maybe have a better back-end deal than make it a bit more complex and at the end, you know, much more difficult to partner.
That's I think a really good point, especially as we're seeing, you know, more and more large pharmas focus on China being a very important emerging market for them, and a growth, you know, where a lot of growth will come from in the future. I think if, you know, in the past, that made a lot of sense to get a Chinese partner and not license the rights for China. But I mean, going forward for a global partner, that maybe make your deal less attractive if you don't have those rights.
Well, especially if you go very often with China, we've seen a lot of deals with very different companies. So there are some very solid partners in China. There are others that have absolutely no track record and
good point.
are going to be difficult to validate. And there, you know, you take a quick cash, but you take a lot of headaches there.
Yep, I think that is a really important point for, as you think down the line, if you're thinking about doing regional rights. I agree with everything that you said, that a lot of the larger companies do think about China as the emerging market, and they're less accepting of when those rights have been licensed away. But if it is going to bring in enough money to extend your runway even farther, and so you think it's the right strategic thing to do, having the right partner because once as you're going through clinical development and everything else, there is a lot of cooperation and collaboration and information transfer that must happen with your other global partner that you will have. So I think those are really important points for us to keep in mind. One of the things that I did want to sort of touch on, because we've had a couple of questions have come up, and it is, I think it's really important as part of partnering and also what's financeable, is this concept around digital health, AI and ML in in discovery and development, honestly. And how is that the progress that's been made in the utilization and understanding of machine learning technologies and algorithms? Is that changing? Are these companies still really attractive? What types of these companies are really attractive? Because we've seen a real explosion in the formation of companies around this. How are they getting funded? So let's take a few minutes and sort of talk about our own perspectives on the use of data sciences and machine learning and AI in our life sciences business. Who wants to jump in?
I can kick it off by just talking about from a company building standpoint. I think just to make the point that I think most companies today that have a discovery component, and even ones that don't, have an element of computation work integrated in their workflow to some extent. When we think about AI and ML, we're mostly thinking about kind of the use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, to either enhance how we approach discovery of molecules that tend to be long, costly, or has a high rate of attrition. That tends to mean small molecules. So I think there's a large number of companies with kind of innovative AI ML platforms that are being applied to the small molecule space. One of the big innovation in the space, of course, is AlphaFold. And when that came out of DeepMind, and then when that became publicly available, I think that really kind of opened up the floodgates in the ways that we approach design, both based on an AI ML application. I think broadly speaking, we've seen from an emerging company standpoint, a number of companies in the AI ML space that are going after small molecules. I think for us, from an investment standpoint, or maybe just reflecting on maybe my personal views on this space, I think for us, or for me, sorry, really trying to understand how you'll eventually get a differentiated product with AI ML is still something that we're still trying to figure out. We haven't really seen, when you look at these AI ML companies, how their pipeline is different from maybe a more traditional biotech company. So I think the first iteration of the impact that we're seeing for AI ML is more in regards to cost savings, maybe kind of reducing the attrition rates that we tend to see in more complex molecule space, which is predominantly small molecules. But we're not seeing transformational differentiation in the actual modality or the product just yet. And so that is a big question that we have, that we constantly think about, like how much will AI ML actually transform, the types of drugs that we see that actually come out of these platform companies.
And I could just jump in here. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and it's moving very fast. And so, I'm certainly no expert. But, when you think about the chemical space, as Yushine was just talking about, that is large, but finite, right? When you think about the biological space, like we really have no idea. And I think at the end of the day, it's not really the algorithms and the computation itself. I mean, those become somewhat commoditized. I mean, I don't want to offend anybody who has, unique algorithms, but I think at the end of the day, it's the data that you're working with. And so how do you really have a really unique data set? I don't think you can do that entirely from public data sets. I mean, you can get far, but those companies that have a wet lab component, that have this bit of a virtuous cycle with the computation and their experiments, I think those are the ones that are going to be able to generate those unique data sets that maybe will get them something that's truly differentiated. And then others will use public data sets to maybe get to some products faster. Derek Lowe, my colleague who has a prolific blog and is an amazing blogger and a great thinker, has written extensively about this and about AlphaFold. And he made a really great point. He said, that's really not what's limiting us. What the biggest cause of failure is that the target that we thought was going to work doesn't work, right? We can engage the target and then, you know what, it's not the biology we thought it was, and we get surprised by the biology. So I think until we really understand that biology space better, and I think computation can certainly help with that, I think maybe we can get there faster. I'm not sure we're going to have more success. That would be very interesting to see how that pans out.
It's probably something that is more having a bigger impact in the creation of the company, where you say, okay, can I move faster with that? From a partnering point of view, you're going to judge the program to its merit, whether it was created through AI or more traditional way is not going to be that to the decision.
I mean, we've certainly seen some high-profile deals, right? I mean, in the in vitro deal with Gilead, and Recursion had that really big deal with Roche recently announced. Accenture has had some big deals. So these very high-profile elite companies are doing well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that a lot of times, Dawn, I agree with you that we are looking for, sometimes it's good it's good enough that it can speed up the process faster on biology that we already have confidence in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is, I think that's where some of the interest lies for us. But I think in many ways, it's important, and I've seen this throughout through some of the deals that are getting done and such, that the real value is in the companies that have the ability to do the cycle themselves, do some biology, or some wet lab work. Just a slight diversion, because there's a question on it. And I think right now, for the audience, we're moving into sort of our Q&A and answering the questions that we've gotten through the Q&A. For digital, there's a question around digital therapeutics and companies that do that, and especially around diagnostics or various other things that are very focused on digital. Is this attractive? So is it attractive from the perspective of partnering, but also perhaps from the investing standpoint? My view, and people can disagree with me, is that we're still working on trying to find a way to monetize some of these digital therapeutics and companion diagnostics. And so that's something that if a company if a pharma company has a product and a digital therapeutic or a digital diagnostic could go along with it, that could be of value to keep, to have compliance better or outcomes better. I think that's great. Does anybody else have any other sort of insight into the digital therapeutics companies and investment and monetization?
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Leslie. I think it's really challenging to get reimbursement and to get prescribed. If you want to, have an app, a digital therapeutic that's prescribed by physicians and other prescribers, I think it's really challenging to get it prescribed, to get the patient to download it, to get the patient to use it, to get insurance companies to reimburse for that, and the margins are just are pretty slim too. So it's super challenging. I think right now, if there was a way to enhance the value of a higher margin asset like a medicine, then and improve the experience for patients or improve outcomes for patients, then it could add a lot of value in the pharma sector. As a standalone digital therapeutic, I think there could, there's some great, health companies out there that have been very successful with mental health apps and other things. But, in terms of that intersection with pharma, I think it has to be very asset centric.
Yeah, there are some initiatives by some government, I think Germany, France, and and others that are starting to create a path for reimbursement. Not enough, and probably still quite slow. There's still the problematic that you mentioned on prescribing and getting people to see that as true solutions, and it's not yet in the habits. I mean, it's something different if it's something that is supportive of a treatment, where you monitor your diabetes or the side effects of your oncology treatment. But as a treatment per se, it's still a little bit in the infancy. On the other side, I really believe that this is coming, and that there's a nice future of that. So it's a matter of we're still in the difficult times.
Yes, and thank you for reminding me, Philip. So there's some great incentive program, as I recall, in Germany, right, to get reimbursement for these kinds of tools. And I think that the theory there is you could take some of the burden off the healthcare system in order to have this type of digitization. Yeah,
I agree. And I think that it's also interesting. This is so having this conversation around sort of linked digital therapeutics, there's a question that came in on drug device combinations. And, what do we think, or do the panelists have an opinion around investor appetite or partnering appetite for drug device combinations?
I mean, I can start just to say, I personally don't focus on devices, but there are certain therapeutics and modalities or indications that do require a drug device combo. So for back of the eye applications, we've seen a lot of difficulties with getting even some of like the newer innovative delivery systems to the right cell types for back of the eye. And so that does beg the question on maybe innovation on, different types of devices to access the back of the eye in a way that doesn't create too much insult when it's being administered. So we've seen, groups coming up with maybe different needles or new innovative needles that is delivering the product to the right area that has the minimal level of impact and toxicity for back of the eye. So I think, again, it's all about the value story. And I think in some instances, there's very strong appetite for those sorts of combinations.
Yeah, and it's also the value that you can create by making the treatment easier, but also monitoring in a better way the compliance and what happens to for treatments that are a bit difficult to where the schedule of the treatment is really important, and having some more data about that. But yeah, it's still something that is an adjunction to the treatment.
Yeah, and I think if you have a killer, again, finding the killer app for your device and what's the, where can you get started to show the value? I think there's still some real interest in work around perhaps not just the back of the eye, but oral delivery of biologics. Items like that where you can truly identify the value proposition. And I think that there are a number of companies, larger companies, who are happy to collaborate to help you, show that value proposition. Cool. Let's see. I think that, so you have a couple of very specific questions that maybe you could address rapidly. So one of them is, does MPM only invest in platform therapeutics, or do you invest in single asset companies as well, just the firm broadly? So very MPM focused.
Yeah, we have a heavy focus on platforms, as you can see from our portfolio. But we have vehicles like Cullinan, which is more of a LLC structure that allows us to access single asset opportunities.
Great, thank you. There's another question for you. For an early stage company with a first-time CEO, what qualities do you like to see in that CEO and the fledgling executive team that makes you feel like they would be a good company to invest in?
I love that question. Great question.
I love that question too. We can all talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can start, and of course, would definitely love to hear Don and Philip's view here. I mean, I think for me, decision making and maybe just kind of just maybe being unarmed. So just maybe being open to building a team that sometimes is in very specific areas have the expertise that's maybe better than yourself. So it's just kind of that humility, but then also decision-making capability is really important for me.
That's great. So as I mentor a lot of startup companies, and so I've met a lot of founder CEOs, and the best founders to work with are those, it's just like you said, Yushine, is they're humble, but they have a point of view, and they will challenge any questions, but they are always open to being wrong. And I think that in terms of mentors, in terms of your leadership team, don't be the smartest person in the room, right? Hire people who are better than you, and who really, as a team, you guys can function at the highest level. And but you do need to have a point of view. You need to be decisive. You need to lead the team, but do so in a way that everyone feels included and is brought along the way with you.
Yeah, and definitely having the vision and being able to lead and convince the team, the partners, the investors, but also being able to decide and take the decisions in tough times like now is really something that is important. And we're going to see a lot of situations now with challenging decisions to be made.
I think it's also just one other comment around, in particular, as you create your pitches and talk to investors. And I mean, we also have a strategic investment arm. Dawn, you guys have a strategic investment arm. I think it's really important. One of the things that I often see that is missed when the leadership team is talking about their technology is actually a really broad and clear understanding of who their competitors are and really how their technology is differentiated from what else is going on in our space and in our industry. And I do find that the ones that the leadership teams that give me the most confidence are the ones that actually have a very good understanding of that and are open about talking about it. And so they take a lot of time to do their homework on that, which I think is really important. Let's see, we have another question around sort of this concept on platform versus products. And how would you characterize the difference between the two? Would the platform involve multiple studies, drugs, therapeutic areas? And I think, so I know, Dawn, you touched on this a little bit earlier, and then I know also, when we were talking about this difficult environment and how platform companies really do have to focus. But, Dawn, why don't you start, and then we'll move to other folks.
So my experience of what I've seen with companies, that the platform-based companies, is that this challenge with resource allocation to platforms versus programs, how do you continue to invest in building your platform, making it better versus your lead programs, and then also as you're thinking about your value creation strategy, making sure you can get to an important value inflection point, with the capital that you have at hand. So you can't spread it too thin, which we were talking about earlier about decreasing burn rates. It has been very easy for founders or for CEOs to get sort of ahead of their skis in terms of valuation and have these big plans, and then not everything goes right. And so you really need to think about dynamically reallocating capital to make sure you can get to those value inflection points. But I think Yushine, you have much more experience in building platform companies.
I think we tend to think about maybe just a definition to use is maybe from an IP standpoint, the composition of matter as being kind of the true defining feature of what defines a platform. So, if it's a single drug that allows you to go into different methods, so different indications, different doses, we would still call that a drug, just a single drug or a single asset. Where, if you have a composition of matter that gives rise to new composition of matter, then that's a platform in the truest form. And so examples of that, of course, are, like editing platforms or, lipid nanoparticles, like deliver platforms. So one that you can actually use to enable the development of a distinct drug product or drug. So, I think maybe that's just answering the question directly of who you view as a platform versus a drug. And again, it's, to Dawn's point, is really just being very thoughtful and strategic around how to really utilize the strategy to drive or maximize value, be it for a platform or a single asset. Because I think, again, there are different ways to think about partnering or accessing different pools of capital for both platforms as well as around a single program.
Great. Another question is around, as we think about what companies will survive this, and startups, early stage companies, is there a question, I mean, do we think success prediction is around business model, technology, pipeline strategy, all of the above?
Yeah.
Good question.
I mean, to me, it is a combination of leadership, science, and frankly, luck. I mean, there's no discount the element of luck in drug discovery and drug development. It does take a lot of grit and resilience to be in this industry. I used to say you have to be a pathological optimist, right? To stay in the industry, because most things do fail. And it was someone else who said it's not a good drug unless it's been killed 3 times. And you've seen some very successful companies who've been through these dark times, right? Look at Alnylam, right? Probably one of our most successful recent examples. And I'm sure John, you've heard John talk about the very dark times that they went through. So, live to fight another day, do what you need to do, be resilient, and be optimistic. I don't think entrepreneurs can be anything but optimistic. I think that's in their DNA.
Yeah, and flexible. I think the business model piece is like, just evolve, iterate, just make sure that you can evolve with the times.
Yeah, what I say always to people I mentor is put yourself in a position to being lucky, and this is where leadership matters.
How do you
take advantage of serendipity?
Luck might come, and if you're not prepared, you might miss it.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent point. Yeah, I think so too.
Absolutely.
So there is actually sort of an interesting question, I think, for all of us is there still, has the pandemic or anything else sort of changed the attractiveness of companies that are not located in the hubs of San Francisco, Boston, San Diego, North Carolina,
or any of the European hubs?
And any of the European hubs. So is there still, is there any broader interest in looking for these companies that are outside of these areas? I mean, interestingly, so I'll just give an anecdote. Back in sort of the mid 2010s, the hard part was investors are on a lot of boards, right? You get some investors are on 7 to 10 boards. That's a lot. And all those board meetings were in person, right? Mm-hmm. And so they had to travel to these board meetings. And so this is like, well, I can kill 5 stones with 1 flight to a hub, right? Has the attitude changed? Are we looking for investments in companies that are outside of these hubs? And do we think we've got that the talent exists outside of these hubs?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can kick it off just by saying, from a company creation standpoint, it's about the technology and kind of the entrepreneur, the founder, and that's not, it's concentrated in these hubs, Boston, San Francisco, in the UK, Oxford, Cambridge. But there's, looking at even the MPM portfolio, there's many companies where, the founding technology didn't come from one of these specific hubs. So when it comes to technology, I think we're quite broad. And I think the pandemic made it easier to actually tap into these kind of non-hub regions, because we could just do, Zoom calls. Whereas before, we would prefer to have in-person meetings to really meet with the founders. So from a company creation standpoint, where we're always thinking about, innovative technologies, the pandemic made it easier, but I would say that we've always been quite broad in our thinking when thinking about accessing innovative technologies to put into companies from day one. I would comment also just maybe on just board and maybe for some of the, not only MPM, but maybe just broadly speaking from the investor side, there has historically been a very strong focus on just making sure that, as you build your portfolio, that there is that region specificity, because especially for the early stage companies where they do require a lot of mentorship. So for seed Series A, we're very involved typically for company building firms. And so it's important to have that touch point in that hub or that region. I think the pandemic has afforded us the ability to become a bit more comfortable with the virtual nature of not only establishing, but maintaining relationships between the board, the investor, the founder, and management teams. And I think we'll continue to see that as we come out of it. And I would say that that's maybe one benefit to allow us, if you're looking at syndication, whereas before you would say we'd want, a company to be based in Boston. Now I think we're a little bit more comfortable to say, okay, majority of the Zooms, or maybe 50% of the Zoom, 50% of the board meetings, will be on Zoom. And so there's a little bit more flexibility to what I've observed, not only from my firm, but then also just more broadly in the venture community, just more comfort with looking at companies outside of specific regions.
Yeah, I think both the pandemic and where we all went to virtual hybrid work, but also the influx of capital has led to an expansion beyond the traditional hubs as lab space got super expensive and rare in some of the hubs. As talent got more and more expensive in the hubs, you see expansion to other areas. And this was happening by some, maverick firms even before, many years before, in terms of, think of Versant, who, was first into New York in the States and big in Canada. So I'm just going to do my plug for Canadian science, which is always, which is stellar. And I think still, those hubs in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal probably still underappreciated. So you did see a little bit of this before, as you just have more capital coming in and looking for more deals. Like, that you just, not all the great science happens in Cambridge and San Francisco. We have great science happening all over the world, or Oxford. We have great science happening all over the world. And but I think that the limiting, what I've seen with Canadian ecosystem, which I know probably better even than the European ecosystem, is that lack of managerial talent has been a bit of a break on the growth. And so, that's seems to be a rate limiting step in company formation, that experience C-suite talent.
Yeah, from a partnering point of view, it's I think we're all in theory agnostic of where we're going to find the right program, and we're really and the pandemic has made it easier to just go anywhere. And while in the past we would have to send teams to do due diligences in some remote location, now with Zoom meetings and virtual data room, we can do a lot. That being said, we've also started thinking about, when we talk about the integration of the deal, how easy is it going to be to interact with the company, with the originator, if they are in a very remote location, and would that make it more risky to have a deal with certain companies, and it might be because of COVID or just because of the difficulty to access and to have meetings, face-to-face meetings to sit on and to look at data or to access some facilities.
That's great. So I know we're running at time, Sarah.
Yeah, you've got 2 minutes. 2 minutes. I do just want to add that during this time we covered during Biotech Showcase a deal that was done where due diligence was conducted by drone. By drone, and the deal went through. I cannot tell you how many CEOs did their follow-ons. They hired people, they expanded their operations, they did IPOs via Zoom. So I think Zoom has really opened the world up in a lot of ways and allowed investors and those people that have a compassionate interest in, seeing therapeutics develop, access, opportunities that they may not have been able to access before. And hopefully it's reduced your airline miles a bit. And also that burn.
Well, if it saves time in the airport.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Somebody once told me during one of our Zoom meetings that this person, a major banker, was busier now because he never got to relax anymore at airport lounges or on the planes. So he was, doing more deals at that point in time. So with that said, I think maybe, I'd like to say thank you to everybody. You can hear the time is up. Is there any one last round of words or comment that you would like to make to our audience?
Hang in there.
Yeah, keep on innovating because we need it. We absolutely do.
I think, Dawn, that is the comment of the day, to hang in there. So with that said, I do thank you all for your time. Thank you so very much, Leslie, for leading it, Yushine, Philippe, Dawn for joining us, and Patrick for bringing yourself together with Demy-Colton to pull this off. Thank you all.
Great.